Hello and welcome back to the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Neufeld. Today, Jordan is back with me and we are going to discuss pensions and employer-sponsored retirement savings plans. What happens to these things if you leave your job, if you retire, or you quit? Okay, Jordan, welcome back to the podcast, man. And we got another sunshiny day here, folks. This is a good time to be in Saskatoon, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's nice that summer is finally here.
Thanks again for joining us today. If this is the first time you're listening, click on that follow button if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify. It used to say subscribe, I think, but now everything's talking about following. Follow along and you'll be able to hear a new episode from us every couple of weeks about topics just like this. But today we're talking about what happens to your savings plans at work, specifically your pensions, if you leave. And this is pretty relevant these days. You might have heard or seen headlines about something called the Great Resignation. Everybody's hiring because COVID-19 has kind of thrown a monkey wrench into a lot of parts of the employment market. And so the average employee actually has a little bit more power. And so there's been a lot more shifting around of jobs. So if you quit, if you get laid off, unfortunately, if you're fired, but even if you retire early, you might have a pension at your previous place of work, an RSP matching program, a deferred profit sharing plan, all these things. What happens to you and those plans when you leave? So this podcast is going to highlight what are those different programs and what can you do with those options. Jordan, let's take it away here. What kind of pensions are there?
Yeah, this is a good place to start. So before we even get into discussing what can you do with it, should you leave, quit, retire, we need to know what kind of pension you even have. So there's a bunch of different options, but there's kind of four main ones we're going to touch on here. So first one being RRSP matching. So that might be you contribute 3%. I'll just use a number. Your employer might match up to 3% as well. That number is going to vary depending, but that's just like a typical registered retirement savings plan that you might have.
Let's just confirm again, an RSP matching isn't a pension.
It's not a pension.
But people often think of it as the same way.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, it's not going to be constrained by pension legislation like some of the other plans that we're going to talk about here, but it is a common plan that you might see via a workplace or employer-sponsored program.
Right. So you put in 3% to your RSP, comes right off your paycheck. You don't pay tax on it because an RSP comes right off the top. If you go back and listen to our perfect RSP strategy, this is one of those times where it actually does work pretty well regardless of your income bracket, because you don't have to have the discipline to invest a refund, because usually there's no refund because if they're taking it right off the top of your check. So that's great. Now, when most people think of a pension, that means a guaranteed payment for the rest of your life. Talk about that one a little bit.
Yeah. So we got something called a defined benefit pension plan, DB for short, that you might hear. That's kind of exactly how it sounds. So defined benefit, the benefit is clear, it's known, it's guaranteed, and it's calculated based on the details of the plan. Every plan is going to vary slightly with how it's calculated, what factors go into calculating the benefit and all that sort of thing. But the point is, the benefit that you will receive once you are eligible is known and guaranteed for life.
One of the most common ways to calculate a DB pension will be a multiple of certain years of income. Sometimes it's your last 5, sometimes it's your whole career, but it'll be a factor of how much you earned because you are contributing to it over time. So it's then a factor of how much you've kind of contributed to the plan. So it's some sort of multiple based on an average earnings throughout your time with the employer, plus your age and years that you worked there. And so if your age plus the number of years worked reaches the magic number, then you qualify to receive the full benefit from your pension. Many cases, it's something called like the rule of 80 or the rule of 82, something in the ballpark of those numbers. So that means if you're at a rule of 80 and you are 55 and you worked for 25 years, there you go. I think I did the math right there, didn't I, Jordan?
Yes.
It's early here. Yeah. So in that case, this person would qualify for early retirement benefits starting at age 55. We don't need to go into the specifics there, but that's just kind of how pensions are typically calculated. Okay, what's the other one? The one that's much more common these days.
Yeah, DBs are becoming, they were more common and over time they've just become less and less common.
Because they're expensive, interest rates are lower, it's tougher to make money for them.
And the employer's taking on all the risks. Investment performance doesn't matter in the DB. You know what your benefit is and you get it no matter what. What's becoming more common as plans have transitioned to this, and there's some large employers here in Saskatchewan that are, switching to this program right now. It's called a DCPP, or a defined contribution pension plan, DC for short. In this case, it's a little bit different as the contributions are specified, both from you and your employer. But what's different is the amount that you will receive upon retirement is not guaranteed. And so instead, investment performance absolutely does matter. So you can kind of think of it as you're working, you're contributing, it's growing the pile bigger and bigger. What you have available for you upon retirement depends on how it's invested, how well those investments performed, and how much you've contributed. And so when we compare that to the DB, where the DB investments doesn't matter, what you're going to receive is known, guaranteed. DC, what you contribute is known and guaranteed, but what you receive on the back end is unknown until you get there.
Yeah, highly variable based on what investment selection you pick. So if you're a conservative investor, which is just fine, you have to actually pick the investments yourself or with the plan sponsor. Sometimes there's an advisor associated with that. They can help you out with that. But you could be also a little bit more aggressive and hopefully make a little bit more return over the lifetime of your DC pension. So yeah, at the end of the day, your defined contribution pension plan isn't that much different than RSP matching. So typically what happens is you'll contribute some and your employer contributes some. And now you've got your pool of money and you got to make it work. The way that it's different is that it is under pension legislation, which means that there are specific rules, because the idea, or the government's idea of a pension at the very least, is that this should be money for life. And so even though you carry all the risk and there's an investment risk associated with it, there are typically quite specific rules on how you can turn that into income later. And the government has to make sure that that stays under pension legislation, unlike your RSP, which is a bit more flexible in many cases. Last one, maybe let's talk just very high level here about a deferred profit sharing plan.
Yeah, you may see that once in a while. It's maybe not quite as common. That's going to be from the profits. Only the employer contributes to this plan. In particular, if you have it, it probably has a vesting period on the dollars that are contributed to it. So if dollars are contributed today, there might be a 2-year vesting period, meaning they're not actually yours until 2 years expire or passes. You may see it in conjunction with an RRSP plan. So perhaps if you've got a workplace program set up, you contribute to the RRSP, but your matching component or whatever the employer decides to contribute goes into a DPSP, that deferred profit sharing plan. Again, maybe we don't need to get into the too many nuances, but just know that it does exist and perhaps you have one.
For sure. Little piece of advice maybe we'll put in here is that if you have the capacity to contribute more and your employer can match it, try to take advantage of that. If
it's typically a pretty good deal.
Free money is the best money. So if your employer will match up to 6%, really take a hard look at your cash flow every month to see if you can take advantage of that. Because if you can get that money from them, that is probably almost the universal piece of advice here, that if you can afford to take full advantage of the match, do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Jordan, you quit your job. I hope not actually here, but you hypothetically quit. I'm not going to pretend that I'm firing you, or you're retiring. Let's do that one.
Sure.
Jordan, you're retiring early. Now, what can you do with these plans?
Yeah, so the options that you have are going to kind of overlap here between a couple of them, and they're going to differ as well from depending on what type of plan you have. So kind of at a high level, once you resign or retire, you should receive a letter from the pension administrator outlining your options. So that typically should come within a few weeks, 3 months, maybe kind of max. It might depend. But anyways, once you receive that letter, it's going to outline, here's your options, what you can do with your money now that you are no longer employed with us. You'll have a certain amount of time to make that decision. Otherwise, there'll be a default option that's chosen. It's not secret. The default option will be noted. You'll know what it is, but basically you have a certain amount of time to act. Otherwise, the default goes into place.
It won't be permanent. The default option isn't permanent, but there's just a period of time before they say, okay,
they need to do something with it or whatever.
Yep.
But even after that, there's still options. So let's say you've got the defined benefit pension plan. There's a few options that are available to you.
Let's assume you're leaving early, because if you retire, you're just going to get that payment for life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Not all these options, I think it's worth noting, will be available to you. It's worth reading your pension booklet or having your advisor read it or somebody look into it, just because every plan is different. High level though, option number 1, you can leave it. You don't need to do anything with it. You'll leave it within the plan. And then once you become eligible, typically at age 65, then you can start to receive that benefit that's defined based on the calculation that's there.
And in that case, because you left early before you qualified for, say, your rule of 80, your rule of 82, your rule of 78, whatever the case is, you would receive a smaller benefit than if you would have stayed there and hit that rule. And you also can't take it earlier than 65, in most cases anyways, earlier than 65. So sometimes it's called a deferred benefit, and you can probably see that on your pension statement. It's like, this is how much you'd qualify if you left it today and then started taking it again at 65. So that's an option where you can just leave it there and hope you remember it at age 65.
Option 2. So second option, you can possibly transfer, it's called a lump sum commuted value. So typically when we're talking about a DB, that's a monthly benefit that you receive. Instead, you can transfer some commuted value to a locked-in retirement account, which basically, again, under pension legislation, it's locked in, though, and you can't access it until a certain period of time. So that commuted value will be defined for you on your letter. You'll know what that value would be. You are taking on the risk now. And so if you leave it, they're still managing it. They're responsible for it. If you take on that commuted value, now you have to decide entirely, what do I want to do with this money? Do I want to invest it? How do we want to invest it? What does that look like? How do we want to take income out at a certain point? When all those decisions become your decisions to make, but it is an option that you can transfer it out of the plan.
And when we talk about commuting it, that means just moving it. But when you think of a DB pension, that is a stream of income in the future. And so what they do is they calculate how much money do you need upfront to equate to that future stream of income. This gets a little bit complicated, and this calculation changes over time based on a number of factors internal to that pension. So we can't blanket say, yes, you should always transfer it, or yes, you should always leave it. That number and that assessment will change over time. So if you do have the option to commute it, have a look at it. As Jordan said, yeah, it'll go into something called a LIRA after that, a locked-in retirement account, and there are specific rules with that. You can't withdraw from a LIRA. You can't contribute to it. Once it's in there, it's there. And then once you want to start taking money out, then it turns into something called a LIF, or here in Saskatchewan, and I think in Manitoba very recently now, something called a prescribed RIF. Oh boy, this is another podcast entirely, but there are very specific withdrawal rules that are applicable to this. Just like I said at the beginning, they try to make sure that that money still acts like a pension. So in most provinces besides us here in Saskatchewan, there is a minimum that you have to start taking out at a certain age, but also a maximum. So I refer to a LIRA like a bucket, but a bucket with a hole in it and a lid on the top. So you have to start taking some money out. That's the hole in the bottom, but you can't take out as much as you want. There's a lid on the top of it. So maybe that's not helpful. But anyways, that's something to keep in mind when it comes to a deferred benefit pension plan.
Absolutely.
What if your new employer also has a DB pension?
Yeah, there might be an option to transfer it to the new plan. Again, check out your details, but you may be able to, lump in your old DB with the new plan and kind of keep it going, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, that can be a little bit complicated because the calculation rules are going to be different at both pensions for sure. So if that's something that you really want to do, anticipate a lot of headache and administrative work, but it'll be fine.
It's an option still.
Yeah, if they allow for that, then you can pursue that one. Last one is that you can buy an annuity. So essentially you can buy your own pension. An annuity is just something where you exchange dollars today for a stream of income in the future. So that's something that you can consider as well. Okay, let's jump ahead to a defined contribution pension plan. Because there's no specific stream of income starting at any specific age, what are the options here?
Not a lot different, to be honest.
Okay.
Option 1, again, you can leave it. They will happily still manage your money, I guess, or be responsible for that. You have to provide the direction on how you want it managed, to be clear. Option 2, you can transfer it out, just like with the DB, you can transfer it out to a LIRA, a locked-in retirement account. The value is a little bit easier to calculate in that, or you'll know what the value is that you can transfer. Third option, again, you can transfer it to another employer pension plan, depending on your new employer and what that looks like. You can also buy an annuity. It's a lump sum amount that you could turn into creating again. That would be an interesting case where you're taking a DC and kind of turning it into a DB based on...
You don't see it very often, especially because interest rates have been so low, but you might start to see it more now as GIC and bond rates are much higher due to higher interest rates. Yeah.
So largely the options aren't too different necessarily from a DB.
Yeah, a few more knowns, because with the DB pension, if you try to move it out of there, you're kind of at the whims of that mysterious calculation. Whereas with the DC pension, it's like, okay, well, it's been in this international equity fund and I know exactly that there's $247,000 in there. Perfect. If I move it out to a lira, there's $247,000 there.
Absolutely.
Right. It's whatever. So that one's pretty straightforward. So again, once you leave your position with a DC pension, actually, even if you retire at a typical age, the options don't really change there for you compared to when you leave early. So that one's a little bit more straightforward when you get your pension options when you leave. Now, with an RSP, it's a little bit different. Again, a bit more simpler. Maybe we're going most complicated to simple here.
I think
this is a nice flow. I love
Absolutely.
it. Yeah. So with an RSP, you can leave it with them. Again, most pension or RSP group, like we call them group RSPs, the providers are usually insurance companies. But here in Canada, most insurance companies are also massive investment fund providers as well. Think of Sun Life, Manulife, Canada Life. Who else? Industrial Alliance.
Those would be the big ones, I think.
RBC also does a bunch of group business. So they would love to keep it for you. In many cases, you would still be able to participate in the discount on the investment management fees. So depending on how it's invested anyways, in some cases, it could be an affordable option. If that's something that's really important to you, it might be marginal and might actually be more expensive. So that's just something to keep in mind there. Or if you have an RSP elsewhere, if you do it yourself, if you've got it at the bank or with an advisor, you could typically transfer it directly into your own existing RSP. Pretty simple.
Yeah, what's nice about that is if you've got a couple different RSP accounts, then you can kind of combine them and make it a little bit more amalgamated. Again, that's not the answer necessarily, but it might add to some simplicity as opposed to having plans all over the place and values all over the place. And then when you do turn the tap onto income, then it's coming in from a variety of locations, and it can just maybe add more headache than it's worth, depending.
For sure. Lots of what we see here in our office is that folks want to combine things as much as possible, at least have it all under one roof. For sure. That makes a ton of sense to me. And for some people, if you're in a field, so if you're in health services or you're a teacher and you move from school divisions or things like that, where every different division would have a different pension or something like that, what you can do if you have multiple pensions that you move throughout your career, if you have now remember things go into a lira, if you have say an Ontario lira, and now you have to get another Ontario lira, you can actually combine those. So I said at the beginning, you can't contribute to it again, but if you have multiple pensions to be transferred from the same jurisdiction, you can lump them together. So that can kind of simplify things a little bit too. We see that once in a while.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, deferred profit sharing plan.
Again, you can transfer that to a personal RSP account or one that you manage on your own. If it's vested, the key thing there is take a look at the vesting period and make sure that the money has vested. Or you can take it in cash. That's also an option.
Yeah. Every one of these options, every dollar that you take out of them at some point is taxable.
Right.
So the end result, there's no option where you can say, okay, well, I've got this, what used to be taxable source of income and turning into tax-free. No, there's no great planning opportunities there. Every dollar that you take out of a DB, DC, Lira, LIF, RSP, you name it, every dollar that comes out is taxable. So same thing with the DPSP. Maybe I should stop using these acronyms. That's why with the deferred profit sharing plan, you can transfer it to an RSP because the rules are pretty similar. Okay, let's go back and talk about some of the other considerations, specifically for defined benefit pension plans.
Yeah, that one's interesting. Kind of like we've mentioned here a few times, it's probably the most complicated or got the most going on of the options. And so you're going to want to examine your plan closely before making a decision. Take a look at the pension booklet, talk to the administrator if you need to, whatever you got to do. There's a few things, or ancillary benefits that a DB might have that some of the options might not. For example, you might have access to health or dental care benefits by being a plan holder. If you leave the plan, you're going to give that up. You might be entitled to something called a bridge benefit, which is an additional benefit that you would receive before 65 until OAS kicks in. If you leave the plan, you lose that bridge benefit as well. Potentially survivor benefits. So if you pass away, some of your benefit may be passed on to your surviving spouse or partner. Inflation protection, it's a really interesting one, especially today. Your plan benefits may be indexed fully or partially to whatever inflation is. Today, inflation is running quite hot as we, talk about this. Inflation protection is a big one. It doesn't mean it will have inflation protection. It just might.
Right. If you're looking on your pension statement, sometimes you'll see that listed as an acronym called COLA, cost of living adjustment. So if you're looking for something that says inflation, you probably won't find it. You'll probably see cost of living adjustment. So that's something you can look at in your pension documents.
Just another acronym to throw in there.
How many acronyms do we need today, Jordan? This is a good one.
I think the last thing to consider, and don't want to get too a conspiracy theorist here necessarily, but what's the financial health of the company? The DB is being managed by the company. They are responsible for it. If for some reason you think the company's going underwater and 10 years from now, they're not going to be here and down goes your pension with it to some extent, maybe you want to take it out and manage it yourself and assume more of that risk. That's a tough one because who knows what 10 years looks like from now.
For sure. There's a lot of analysis that gets done with a lot of the big US-based companies that have been around forever that still have these DB pensions. So companies like General Electric, for example, they have a massive, massive pension liability with declining revenues and things like that. So there are potential risks at, call them old economy companies like that. But maybe not, right? Things change pretty quickly. But one other thing that you could look at is the funding status of your pension too. So that doesn't mean that your company or your school district or your health authority or whatever is going to fail, but perhaps their calculation was a little aggressive for folks that are currently receiving payments from that pension versus the people that are contributing to it. So here in Saskatoon, one of the common things that has happened is they've adjusted the pension so that retired teachers right now, the vast majority of them are receiving an index pension, whereas someone who is still working as a teacher likely will not receive an index pension, and they're contributing a little bit more just due to the health of that pension. So those kind of things change over time too. Anyways, that's not prescriptive of whether you should leave it or take it out, but just other factors to consider there. One more consideration to make here, and we talked about this briefly already, but your desire for flexibility over the investment management, maybe your comfortability with investment risk, things like that. If you're someone who works with an advisor that you know, like, and trust and want to just keep things simple with them, great. If you're a DIY investor who knows what you want to invest in and how to adjust your payments and whatnot over time, great. If you're someone that's completely new to investing, you don't want to know it, you don't work with an advisor, maybe transferring it out doesn't really start to make a ton of sense there.
Yeah, it depends on your desire. The greater control that you have, the greater personal risk that you're assuming, at least on the investment management side of it. It also gives you flexibility over income. And we talked about minimums and maximums with the locked in accounts, but you can control a little bit more how much you want to take, when you want to take it, that sort of thing. DB, you're getting your monthly check or payment every month. Annuity, similar thing, less control, but more guarantees. And so you need to decide, I guess, where you fall on that desire for managing it and having that control over it. No right answer there.
Yeah, no right answer there. And kind of along with that, just keep in mind that every province has different rules for liras. And so if you do transfer things out in some provinces, I'm not even going to say which because this might be outdated by the time you read it. But in some cases, if you convert your lira to a LIF prior to age 65, that province will let you unlock a certain portion of it over to an RSP. So it's a lot more flexible. In other provinces, if you have some money locked in before 65 and you don't have other employment income, they'll let you unlock a certain percentage of it too. Tons of rules. Here in Saskatchewan, no maximum. So you can unlock and withdraw the whole thing. Again, you pay tax on every dollar, but the rules are all different. So when you're considering transferring it, maybe have a look at your province's rules for how that money will be treated after it has been withdrawn from your pension plan. Jordan, let's wrap it up here and give me a summary of some things that you want to consider if you are leaving, if you quit, if you're laid off, or if you're retiring here. What do we do with these retirement savings plans?
Yeah, so let's say the event has happened where you're moving on for whatever reason. Number one, identify what type of plan you have. That's an important place to start. And then number 2, be on the lookout for that letter from the plan administrator. That's going to be your kind of guidebook, at least to start with. What are your options to take your plan and move it elsewhere or whatever you want. Via the letter, and also, looking at your plan booklet and some of the documentation, identify those options that are available to you and examine the possible considerations that need to be evaluated when making your decision. This is where you might want to bring in your professional advisors if you work with someone. Hopefully they'd be happy to help and walk you through just some of your options and help you decide and navigate considerations. Lastly, then initiate your decision. Again, there may be lots of paperwork with that. Follow through to make sure all the transfers take place. Sometimes things just take longer than they should, or
sometimes they need we call it a wet signature, so an ink signature. Yeah. Sometimes you need spousal approval to withdraw some of these things. Lots of complicating factors.
It's humans on the other end as well. And so, I think it's worth being diligent just to make sure that the transfers go through and everything ends up where you expect it to be. So,
gotcha. Perfect. Well, that's good. If you have a situation like this, or if you're considering using a pension plan, or if you are using a pension plan as part of your retirement income and you're looking for a retirement income strategy, there's going to be a link in the show notes here. If you are looking for help with a plan to help structure your retirement income, reach out. This is what we do. And if it's something that you're interested, we'd love to chat with you and see if that's appropriate, or if not, we can point you in the direction of some other resources.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks so much for listening, folks, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Canadian Money Roadmap Podcast. Any rates of return or investments discussed are historical or hypothetical and are intended to be used for educational purposes only. You should always consult with your financial, legal, and tax advisors before making changes to your financial plan. Evan Neufeld is a certified financial planner and registered investment fund advisor. Mutual funds and ETFs are provided by Sterling Mutuals, Inc.